Hi everyone, Mr. P back with lesson 20.2, where we will be doing a comparative analysis of Dr. King and Malcolm X's views on America, Black liberation, and the methods to achieve liberation. Please check out lesson 20.1, where I give you a background on their biographies and their life stories that lead them to these views. But this will be a heavy on the quotes from these two figures. So please pause the video so that you can fully take in the quotes on the slides before listening to my analysis. And again, a lot of my analysis is relying on James Cone's book, Martin and Malcolm and America, as the young James Cone, Black liberation theologist. All right, let's get started. All right, so we're going to focus on their views on white America in particular. So we're going to start with Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, really, throughout his writing and speeches early on, before his Hajj to Mecca, indicts white hypocrisy to both Black and white audiences. Now, his audiences are, generally speaking, are primarily Black audiences. He gives a lot of speeches on the corners of Harlem, on the corners of city streets, and gives a lot of those speeches. But he also visits prestigious colleges and universities because the white media and white educated elite become very obsessed with him, and they invite him to a lot of debates. He was an excellent debater. One reason Dr. King probably never wanted to sit down for a debate with him was because Dr. King knew that he would likely lose. Malcolm X was really skilled with his debate, with debate. So let's take a look at a few of these quotes. He talks about the white man as the devil, and when he says, he writes, "When I say the white man is the devil, I speak with the authority of history." Malcolm X, his early views on race was that followed the Nation of Islam, which taught that white people were inherently evil. And he says in a Playboy magazine interview, "We're anti-evil, anti-oppression, anti-lynching. You can't be anti those things unless you're also anti the oppressor, anti the lyncher." Nevertheless, at times he did assuage and tell white audiences they're not talking about white individuals. You'll notice down here, he says, "We are not speaking of any individual white man. We are speaking of the collective white historical record." And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. He changes his views on white America after his Hajj in 1964, after leaving the Nation of Islam. He leaves behind those previous views that whites were inherently evil. This is because he saw many white Muslims in Mecca traveling, and treating persons of other races quite well. He says, "We were all participating in the same ritual, displaying the spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe could never exist between white and the non-white." So we see here that, his experiences early on in the last video from his childhood, really shaped his views on white people. And this Hajj to Mecca is radically transformative for him. He still will not accept white people into his Organization for Afro-American Unity. He wanted it to focus on Black unity. He still believed in Black separatism as a method for achieving liberation, but he became much less attached to Black separatism as a goal. He never lets go of the goal, and we'll get into that in a little bit. His views on, Dr. King's views on white America. Dr. King, from time to time, became quite frustrated with white moderates who straddled the fence and didn't act on behalf of civil rights and Black equality. In his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, he writes about how he's beginning to arrive at the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. So he's responding here, of course, as we talked about in previous class, to white criticism, white clergy who constantly are telling him to wait, to not act so militantly with nonviolent action, to give the people in power time to act. And he's tired of this. He wants stronger action on the part of white society. He's always trying to appeal to white society. As you can see here at the end of his Selma March 2 years later, he writes, "Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding." He always holds on to the fight to win support of white America. In fact, his dream metaphor is largely directed at white America. Malcolm X often refers to America as a nightmare for Black people, whereas Dr. King always speaks of the dream of a future, and this is what you're probably quite familiar with, his "I Have a Dream" speech, and he developed that metaphor before the "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, and he really directs that at white America to maintain their hope and try and bring them, appeal to their better side. That's what he frequently tries to do in a way that Malcolm X doesn't feel the need to. So how do their goals and vision differ? I want you to be paying attention to the differences, but also the similarities. We don't want to draw too much of a distinction between these two, especially because they approach each other over time. So Malcolm X, in his goals, he retains to the end of his life the long-term goal of separation back to Africa, but he pushes for Black nationalism to try and meet the needs of Black communities in the U.S. now. He's not opposed to achieving voting rights and civil rights, but his long-term goal is one of separation. So he writes, in his Declaration of Independence after leaving the Nation of Islam, but separation back to Africa is still a long-range program. And while it is yet to materialize, 22 million of our people who are still here in America need better food, clothing, housing, education, and jobs right now. You can see very clearly there that it maps onto a lot of the goals of the traditional civil rights movement, as well as the goals of the Black Panther Party. He sort of bridges these spaces. And we'll talk about the Black nationalism and the control of politics in a later slide. Dr. King's goals in his early career focused quite narrowly on ending legal segregation and disenfranchisement to promote civil rights and voting rights. Yet he fully envisions a radical redistribution of economic and political power by 1967. And this is very evident in his plan for the Poor People's Campaign, which he never sees to fruition because he's assassinated while working with sanitation workers in Memphis towards economic justice. And he says here in the America's Chief Moral Dilemma, the speech that is signed to you for this seminar, he writes, for well now 12 years, the struggle was basically a struggle to end legal segregation. But the new phase is a struggle for genuine equality. And because this is now going to cost the nation in a way that integrating lunch counters doesn't, he says that we are dealing with issues that will demand a radical redistribution of economic and political power. And that economic vision is a lasting legacy that gets overshadowed by his "I Have a Dream" speech in James Cones's view and in my view too. He also develops an anti-war stance. He opposes the war in Vietnam. And as you can see in the speech here, he criticizes the spending of billions of dollars on the war. People in Congress voting to spend billions of dollars on the war in Vietnam while not putting money towards a fair housing bill for not just Black veterans, but he for all Black communities as well. And so he really becomes very strongly opposed to the war in Vietnam in a way that he was hesitant to in the mid-60s, but by 1967, he's very clear and outspoken opposing the war in Vietnam. And this is when he begins to lose some of his white supporters and even some Black supporters as well, but it begins to lose some supporters because he's opposing Johnson's what he's doing in Vietnam. We're going to close here with methods to achieve Black liberation. And again, please pay attention to how they are different, but also similar. So let's move forward with that. So Malcolm X's methods. He calls for self-defense, rifle clubs, and obeying the law. Let's be clear here. His self-defense approach is not one that breaks the law. He's not advocating to initiate violence. As you can see here in his Declaration of Independence speech, it is legal and lawful to own a shotgun, he writes. We believe in obeying the law in areas where our people are constant victims of brutality and the government seems unable or unwilling to protect them. We should form rifle clubs that can be used to defend our lives, our property in times of emergency. We should be peaceful, law-abiding, But the time has come for the American Negro to fight back in self-defense whenever and wherever he is being unjustly and unlawfully attacked. So it's a vision for self-defense, not for initiating violence. He emphasizes self-love and self-knowledge. Don't love your enemy, love yourself. He often would make fun of the Black preachers and ministers like Dr. King, who would preach about loving your enemy. And he also gives a speech where he says, "Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? We teach you to love the hair that God gave you." And so he really tries to work to undo the internalized racism. So his audience is primarily concerned with making sure Black people have access to self-love and self-knowledge. And he also pushes for Black nationalism as in the sense of not, a separate country for Black people or a move back to Africa, although that remains his long-term goal, but as a means for achieving lasting improvements in Black lives. And so he wants to control politics and politicians in Black communities. And Dr. King argues against sort of the armed approach, although he did carry firearms early on for self-defense. He does argue for nonviolence, arguing that it disarms the oppressor, that the oppressor controls the force of violence, and nonviolence would disarm them, confound them, confuse them, frustrate them. And he's actually quite concerned that using any kind of violence would awaken genocidal instincts in white society. He uses that term, actually, genocidal instincts, and he's quite nervous about that. And so in some ways, nonviolence is strategic because he thinks it's going to be best accomplish his goals and the movement's goals, but also out of a love for Black life and wanting to avoid white violence against Black life. But of course, Malcolm X's self-defense piece here is also coming from a love for Black life, right? And the need to defend oneself, and that being a fundamental right in his view. All right, so let's move forward to Dr. King's shift here. He also moves towards a radical anti-capitalist vision for liberation. He actually moves closer to Malcolm X's views on Black separatism, emphasizing Black control of politics, just like Malcolm X does. And he also begins to talk about Black power, too. He says here, this is one of my favorite quotes from him in his address to this SCLC conference in '67. He says, "But one day we must come to see the edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Questions must be raised. Who owns the oil? Why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water?" So he begins to develop an anti-capitalist vision. He pushes to control politics in areas where Black people are living, and he proposes taxing people who work in the city but live in the suburbs, because he recognizes that white people benefit from the work in the city but live in the suburbs and have received mortgages financed and insured by the federal government, and Black people did not have access to that. So he begins to push for policies like that tax to redistribute economic power, or in some small way. And he also talks about Black power. He says, and there's no doubt about the need for power. He can't go into the mainstream of society without it. Black power means instilling within the Negro a sense of belonging, appreciation of heritage, a racial pride. We must never be ashamed of being Black. Black is beautiful, and it's so beautiful to be Black. Dr. King really adopts a lot of the language. He even begins to move away slowly, sporadically from the term Negro, which was a term heavily used by Black communities then, to identifying as Black, which is what SNCC and Malcolm X and the Black Panthers begin to adopt. That language begins to shift here in the 60s. I want to close here by saying that Malcolm X was very strategic in how he presented himself, hoping that white society's perception of him as radical and dangerous would make them more likely to compromise with King, thus improving Black lives. He even tells Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott, "I wanted Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking I would make it easier. If the white people realize that the alternative is what the alternative is, meaning him and a more militant stance, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King." And so Malcolm X really tried to be strategic with his the way that he kind of operated in society with his criticisms and his the language he used. So I hope that you've come to see that the two are not that different in many ways and that they have a lot of similarities. All right, looking forward to